Hello everyone, my name is Gary O'Mealy, and in this video we are going to look at a specific example of a physiological process in which many different types of membrane transport processes, which we have of course talked about in previous videos, are actually applied. So what we're looking at here is the absorption of glucose across the intestinal epithelia. The idea here, of course, is that when you eat food, digestive enzymes that are produced in your body help to break down these complex carbohydrates and proteins and lipids into much smaller components that can be easily absorbed across the epithelia that make up the intestines so that these nutrients can be absorbed into the bloodstream and therefore delivered to cells all throughout the body, which are then going to use those nutrients for making ATP by cellular respiration. This is a very good example for us to look at because we can actually see every kind of membrane transport that we have talked about so far in previous videos on display here. So the situation we have is that we have the lumen of the intestine. The lumen just refers to the inner hollow portion of an organ or a tube in the body. So, for example, the bloodstream down here, we're looking at a capillary. The blood plasma is contained within the lumen of the blood vessel itself, or the inner hollow portion. So, if you're thinking of your intestines or your stomach or anything else as being a hollow kind of space-filled organ, the lumen is that space-filled portion inside. So when you eat food, your food is digested in the lumen of your stomach, and then the digested material starts to move through the lumen of your intestine. So here we are looking at individual glucose molecules after they have been broken down, and they are now moving through the lumen of the intestine. However, the glucose in the lumen of the intestine is not going to do us any good. We need to absorb it into the bloodstream. So in order for that to happen, the glucose needs to move across these epithelial cells here by membrane transport. So like I said, we're going to have to use just about every kind of membrane transport in order to get that done. So the first thing that's going to happen is that oxygen moves from the blood plasma into the intestinal epithelia by simple diffusion. This is really no different than how oxygen enters into respiring cells throughout the body in any other way. So this oxygen, of course, is used by the mitochondria of these epithelial cells to make ATP by cellular respiration. The important issue here is that this ATP is going to be highly necessary here in just a minute. So, in a previous video, we talked about primary active transport, the most prominent example of which is the sodium-potassium pump. This sodium-potassium pump exists in the basolateral membrane of epithelial cells, or the bottom blood plasma-facing portion. So this sodium-potassium pump is going to be using a portion of the ATP we are making by cellular respiration to maintain steep sodium and potassium gradients. You'll recall the intracellular fluid is meant to have a low concentration of sodium and a high concentration of potassium. And then the opposite is supposed to be true for the extracellular fluids. So this pump pumps both potassium and sodium against their concentration gradients at the expense of ATP so that we can maintain very steep gradients for both sodium and potassium. These sodium and potassium gradients are going to be used in order to get glucose to move across the apical membrane. The apical membrane is the upper membrane of the epithelial cell that faces towards the lumen of whatever organ or structure that we happen to be talking about. So here again, you can see that glucose exists here in the lumen, but the problem is that the actual working concentration of glucose in the luminal fluid is less than the actual working concentration of glucose in the intracellular fluid. What that means is that if glucose is going to cross the apical membrane, it has to do so by some kind of active transport. We can't use passive transport to move glucose from low to high concentration. So a special carrier that exists in the apical membrane called the SGLT carrier, this is a sodium and glucose symporter. Symport refers to two solutes moving through the same carrier in the same direction and at the same time. And that is distinguished from an antiporter, which transports them in opposite directions. So this is a type of secondary active transport. Glucose is going to move from low to high concentration at the same time as sodium moves from high concentration in the luminal fluid to low concentration in the intracellular fluid. So sodium is moving down its concentration gradient at the same time as glucose moves up its concentration gradient. So secondary active transport. So after this has been accomplished, glucose now exists in the intracellular fluid. It has crossed the apical membrane. So now we just need glucose, now that it's inside the cell, to cross through the basolateral membrane to get access to the bloodstream. This is a much more simple task because since glucose here is at a high concentration in the intracellular fluid and a low concentration in the extracellular fluid, glucose can simply move through the basolateral membrane through a carrier by facilitated diffusion. Remember though, glucose has to move by facilitated diffusion and not simple diffusion because of glucose's polarity. So there absolutely has to be a carrier available to allow glucose to cross through the basolateral membrane. So before we wrap up this video, so at this point we have accomplished our mission of transporting glucose across both the apical and basolateral membranes. So now glucose can get into the bloodstream and be transported to all of the respiring cells throughout the body that are going to use glucose as a fuel substrate for making ATP through cellular respiration. I absolutely do not want you to forget the role the sodium-potassium pump here played. If you're not exactly latching on to what I'm talking about, go back to the very first step in this process and think about what would happen to glucose absorption across both the apical and basolateral membranes if the sodium-potassium pump were not operational. So that really does it for this video. We're just looking at one very specific case of a physiological process that uses all these different types of membrane transport. Here is a list of vocabulary terms you probably want to be aware of. And for checking your understanding, number one, what kind of membrane transport is used in each step of the absorption process? Number two, why would this absorption fail if the sodium-potassium pump were not operational? And finally, other than the intestines, can you find an organ or something else in the body where this specific type of glucose absorption also occurs? Okay, that's going to do it for this video. If you have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the comments section, and I will see you next time.